your hand.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this meeting of the Orkney Archaeological Society. I can see one seat left in the room, other than the one I'm going to sit down on, so we're just about at the stage of saying, I'm sorry, it's standing room only. So, when we decided to have tonight's meeting, the background to it was we wanted to open a legacy project for archaeology in Orkney. And we made an allusion in our online information about it to that famous phrase by Isaac Newton, standing on the shoulders of giants, because it's very much a recognition of progress that is made in archaeology can only be built on prior experience, prior knowledge, indeed prior wisdom. And the legacy project that this is the first meeting of tonight sets out to do that. It sets out to give a context to archaeology in Orkney, to look at past achievements and past discoveries, and look at ways in which they can inform archaeology now in the 21st century. And we're delighted to have for our conversation tonight, it's not a talk, it's not an interrogation, it's a conversation between two eminent archaeologists who have got deep experience of archaeology in Orkney. Messrs Dr David Clarke and Professor Mark Edmunds. David Clarke, who is first on my right here, has a long experience in the field of archaeology, many years presenting public archaeology in what is now the National Museums of Scotland, and led two significant campaigns here in Orkney in the 1970s, Scarborough and the links of Noltland. In the job that I do just now, and I work part-time as a tour guide, I often visit Scarborough. Hold my hands up, I've been there 3 times this week already. And I can tell you that the two names I hear most commonly as I take people round Scarborough are those of Veer Gordonchild and David Clarke. So no pressure there, David. Our other speaker tonight and member of the conversation is Mark Edmunds. Mark has a long, distinguished academic career, University of York, and he is now Professor of Archaeology in the University of the Highlands and Islands. Many of you will be familiar with his book called Orcadian. As one reads it, one thinks, how was he able to write this so elegantly? Because it is a narrative chronology of archaeology in the Neolithic period, combining that rare combination of informed background and evidence mixed with an attempt to get into the mindset, if you want, of the people who lived in these islands over that crucial Neolithic period. We're delighted to have both of these archaeologists here tonight. The conversation, they will be running that themselves. There are no fixed questions. It'll be as the conversation develops itself. At the end of it, I will do a brief concluding remarks, and then we will have the raffle. I don't want to say anything about the raffle. I know many of you will have come into the room tonight and be delighted to see that it was free entry. Well, there isn't quite anything like a free lunch. So if you've got raffle tickets, that's helping to support the event. When you leave at the end, if I can remember, I'll remind you if you wish to give something in the donation dish that we have. Looking after the sound tonight is George, the editor of our magazine. He's sitting at the back there. And, you know, I have hearing loss and I wear hearing aids. And when I come into a hall like this tonight, I admire the beauty of it. But my heart quails when I think about the sound quality. And I know that's the case for a number of people here tonight. Both David and Mark are mic'd up and their voices should be clear. But can I invite you, if you're not hearing clearly and you think a reasonable adjustment can be made, turn round to look at George up in the corner there and give him a signal, and he will alter the sound accordingly. Because it is very important that we are able to hear as well as see what's going on tonight. And on that note, we're being filmed by Fionn tonight. This will be an important part of our legacy project, that we make a professional recording of the event, so as in years to come, this will be our legacy for the future as well. With these two words, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Edmunds and David Clarke.
Thank you very much. So I guess the first question is, can you hear me at the back? No? Yeah. Andrew. Is that all right? You can hear us back there? Yeah. Good, okay, thank you. I was drowned out by a heckler. That's the last of that. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. It's really nice to have such a packed room. Neither of us have ever done this before.
That's right.
We've had lots of conversations, often in the pub, on one occasion at the top of a mountain in the Highlands. So we had thought maybe we could just go to the bothy and do it there, but I don't think we could have got you all in. So the plan for this evening is we're just going to chat. So if it looks like we're ignoring you from time to time, that's just how conversations work, isn't it? But we're just going to talk fairly broadly across a number of different subjects, tracking our way through different aspects of David's career, and then reflecting from that on ways that people are now beginning to explore about the nature of the Neolithic in Orkney, what makes it distinctive, what kind of connections we can see with other places, a variety of different themes. So it'll be fairly broad, quite a sort of a sweep to it, but we'll see how it goes. So David, welcome.
Thank you.
It's very, I do feel like, I don't know, is it Michael Parkinson or Russell Harty? I hope it's not Russell Harty, otherwise somebody might hit me, but okay. So you got here yesterday, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then what have you been up to today? You're in Stromness.
Been out to Scarborough and to try and check a thing which I don't think I've succeeded in checking, but anyway, it's been okay. And then I went to Stromness Museum to see the figurine, Buddo, in his case, because I hadn't seen it since, that was the last time I was in Orkney.
When you found it in the box?
When I found him in the box, yeah. So yeah. I just wanted to see him in all his glory in the case. You know?
Oh, you'll all know Buddo, I'm sure. Yeah, it's remarkable. And for two reasons. One is to get something like that is, especially in whalebone, is really unusual. But also, I don't know, there's just something about the connection to probably the most important man in the 19th century for archaeology here, George Petrie, who deserves a book, someone. We should write about George Petrie.
Yeah, he's a tough guy to write about.
He is a very hard man to write about. There's some archives now online, isn't there, through the NMS. Yeah. But, you know, without him, much of the early work would have just gone unrecorded.
That's right. And the thing about Buddo was I'd known about Buddo. I mean, I'd known the picture, Petrie's picture for, I don't know, 40 years. I'd never seen the object, so, yeah.
And then it just popped out of a box when you were going through?
Yeah, last box we opened in the day.
Excellent, yeah, so. Very good. Okay, so, well, we can start in various places, but maybe the best place to start is just by talking a little bit about how you got going and coming to the National Museum, which I think was 1968, something like that.
Yeah, it was National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland in those days, and we squatted in the left-hand side of the portrait gallery, or that was the way the portrait gallery always saw it anyway. And and the job came because there was going to be a new building for the Scottish collections on the end of Chambers Street. Yeah. And that got cancelled in 1976 in one of these periodic financial crises. So we waited, it was quite a long time. So we got the building.
Yeah, quite a while. But so once you got there, what dropped on your desk? What were the...
Well, one of the things that, in a sense, led me to Orkney was that the museum had the Scarborough collection, or their bit of the Scarborough collection, I suppose is the way to put it, that had come on loan in 1933. And they'd given it loan numbers, and they'd made quite a detailed inventory of it. And that became the sort of excuse for not actually cataloguing it.
Right.
And so when I came, Robert Stevenson said, oh, you can catalogue. That's what we want you to do, catalogue the Scarborough collection. And part of the reason was because at that time there was still the expectation there'd be a new building. And Robert wanted to make a really big thing of Scarborough. And he had organised a couple from Wimbledon College of Art who cast life-size model of House 7. And this thing costs the same. It costs like the equivalent of a 3-bedroom semi-detached house. Yeah, and then these the designers came along and they started saying things like, you mean this place is right beside the sea, but they don't fish? We said, well, there's no evidence that they fish. And I said, you've got a credibility gap here. And so I said, well, and so I said the way to answer it was to do an excavation at Scarborough.
Right.
And for a while, Robert was really reluctant, but in the end, he agreed that was what we had to do. So that was how I came to come to excavate Scarborough.
And then, in doing so, both in the museum and on site, there we are. For those of you who are not familiar with it, Scarborough, the first thing is you're dealing with the legacy of this man.
That's right.
The Gordon Child.
And it's a big legacy because, obviously the background to Child being there is that in the 20s, the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland were kicking up a fuss with the Office of Works because they said that the Office of Works was cleaning out these ancient monuments with no archaeologists present. And the Office of Works was sort of saying, well, it's not quite like that, but, And then they started on Scarborough in 1927 with Wilson Patterson. And the society got very upset. And so Child, who just arrived, and I guess didn't have the opprobrium that he subsequently received in Scottish archaeological circles, they said, oh, he's obviously the man, let's send him up. But he was never allowed to really do very much. He was just observing and trying to rescue archaeology. I mean, they were in the process of turning a monument that they'd been given into a visitor attraction.
Yeah.
And, you can tell from the remarks that Child makes about discoveries that took place when he was off-site and all this kind of thing. I mean, he really didn't have any say in it.
But he didn't have any say in coming, I think. It was a condition of getting the chair, wasn't it, in Edinburgh, that he had to take on a field project in Scotland.
And to be fair to Child, he was an enthusiastic, much more enthusiastic than, say, Stuart Piggott, who succeeded him. And so he definitely got out there, and he did, and he used, particularly in the 30s, in places like Lanarkshire, he used excavation as a way of relieving poverty. He was, as you know, he was very politically active.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, it's a fascinating man. I'm a bit of a fanboy when it comes to Child.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about
really
it is that Jimmy Yorston, who worked with Child, not at Scarborough, but with subsequently on Rousey and Rinio, he told me that Child told him that Scarborough was his first baby and he lost it. And I think that's pretty much the way he felt. And what's interesting is when you look at subsequent literature, he often talks about Rinio, but he doesn't talk very much about Scarborough.
It's true, actually. It's true.
And I think it was, he felt a certain sense of embarrassment about what he allowed to get, or what the position he got put in, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting, just in terms of his intellectual development, his career, the timing of that. It's really early to mid-20s when a kind of a commitment to socialism and Marxism becomes a framework for thinking about European prehistory. And you can see that in some of the writings around Scarborough, certainly elsewhere as well. That, there's an attention to materials and an attention to thinking about how the archaeology could be interpreted socially.
Yeah, no, he was
economically and socially.
He was very much, and you know, that was very much sort of out of line with what the traditional antiquaries. You know, I mean, Robert Stevenson told me that, like Graham Callender, you know, Prehistory of Scotland, he wouldn't allow that book to be in the library. You had to, he kept it locked in a drawer in his desk, and you had to ask for it, and then he deemed whether you were worthy of being allowed this very dangerous literature. Excellent. I mean, it's just amazing stuff.
No, certainly a lot of the things that have emerged more recently in the last few decades, you know, the interest of people in, you know, thinking about materials and their sources, even themes like colour, you know, are there in Child's observations.
Yeah.
You got a sense that he was actually thinking about the regional context.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because, you know, as part of the publication, we've there's a woman called Katie Mahue, who's the librarian now at the Institute in Archaeology in London, and she's written a piece about how you can see the Scarborough book as a political statement and reflecting very much Charles' politics and interest. And it's quite interesting because actually for a lot of the time he kept his politics, you know, or at least in terms of his friends, there was a real sharp division. He didn't mix his political guys with his archaeological guys very much.
I think he had real problems with the archaeological establishment.
Yes, I think so.
All the way through. I mean, you know, right up to the time he got that job, but then afterwards as well.
Yeah.
And he had a couple of friends who managed to get him jobs in libraries and things for a little while, but tied him over. But yes, it was tough, I think.
Yeah, well, it was. And, you know, and Robert Stevenson told me that A.O. Currow said that he said, you know, Robert, when we were young men, we thought about our archaeology very deeply and we stuck with it. But this man, Child, he just changes his mind every 6 months. And you know, they clearly wasn't. That was not what you did. You know?
No. Another good reason to admire him, really. I mean, it is interesting. You're right that Rigno is the one that tends to get talked about rather more, which is a shame in a way. But although the thing about Rigno, because he's digging with Walter Grant there, isn't he?
Yeah.
The whisky magnate, and the thing that's always struck me when I go there or when I'm reading through the reports is the timing of that project, because basically they did, I don't know if it was 2 or 3 seasons.
They did one season before the Second World War and one season after the Second World War.
And for some, you know, what that's like for somebody who is so conscious of the way that political forces are working through the world, to start digging in one world effectively, and then
it was very strange too, because, you know, he moved to London pretty much straight after the Second World War. And there are a series of letters in the Institute in London where he's trying to cajole Robert Stevenson, who'd been at Rigno with him, digging, to take over Rigno. And Stevenson is clearly saying, no, I've got this museum to run. You know, I mean, I haven't got time to go to... And they're having this very polite exchange where Child is trying to twist Robert's arm and failing entirely. And then, of course, Walter Grant dies in, 47, 48, something like that. And that's the end of the money anyway.
Yeah, well, he underwrote a lot of work.
Yeah.
Money and spirits.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Highland Park. Very good.
Well, I mean, Nessa Brogger, we've had a whisky dedicated, which is very nice as well. Yeah. Other whiskies are available, obviously. Okay, so let's maybe move on a little bit and talk more about you coming to Scarborough, and let's just have that as a background to that. So this is the first question from Anon, who submitted a lot of questions. Thank you, Anne, whoever you are. When did you first visit Scarborough, and what were your first impressions?
I came in 1971 because Anna and Graham Ritchie were digging. I was trying to think as I came up in the plane, and I meant to check it before I came. I think it was Anna was digging Bucoy.
Right.
But I can't remember what they were digging. But anyway, they said, you know, they had a cottage in Brae, and they said, come up and stay for a little while. And so I came up and, you know, did the tour around the sort of Office of Works monuments of Orkney, which is, and so that was the thing. And I mean, you know, it's gobsmacking, I always think, to see Scarborough. I'm still in awe when I go there, because, you know, nowhere else can you see this sort of three-dimensional workings of a Neolithic interior. And, you know, it's just fantastic. And that I always, you know, I mean, at that time, in 71, I had just been cataloguing the stuff, but all the indications were that we weren't going to come and excavate. And so I didn't come and look and think, oh, this is where we, I just came as a sort of, you know, regular punter looking at it and thinking, wow.
I know, it is amazing.
Yeah.
I remember the first time that I saw it when it hadn't got the visitor centre and all the other
That's
things
right,
around
because
it.
it was just a little hut.
Yeah, there's a little car park just down.
Yeah, that's right. And George Aitken was the curator,
Yeah, that's
was
right.
the custodian, and his wife. It was just him, and it was just the two of them. And, and occasionally his daughter would come and do a tour or two, and that was about it.
It still has that feel in the evenings, particularly away from high summer. Just go in and it's nice and quiet.
Yeah, no, I
Wander
can
around.
imagine.
It's very good. So, okay, one of the prompts was a designer telling you you're not dealing with fish properly.
Well, and then, you know, what became clear, you know, when you sat down, you thought, hang on, we don't really know what the date is. We don't really know anything about the environment or the economy. And so those were the three things that I reckoned we could get some kind of handle on by doing a small amount of excavation. Because we recognised that they weren't going to let us take anything down.
No.
And so there was that space in the middle that had not been excavated. And then there was, in the child at one stage, there was a possibility that they were going to put a roof over the site as a kind of employment exercise in the 30s.
What, like they did with Midhow in Rousey?
Yeah, and he was allowed to dig 12 test pits right down, which were going to be the basis of the pillars, Right. And in one of them, he got waterlogged material. And so that was what we went for, was a trench as close as we could get to that thing, which is out on the left-hand side of the screen. And so that was the second trench that we went for, and, you know, we got really big waterlogged level.
So 71, 72, that's when you're starting to see the more explicit, in the archaeological community generally, explicit interest in questions of the economy, questions of the nature of the sort of social systems that were caught up with that, and things that actually Child had probably put on the agenda first, but they really started to come through then. Yeah,
and also you started to get people, you know, paleobotanists and so on, that wanted to engage with Pollen. You know, I mean, it was obviously coming from Scandinavia, but nevertheless. You know, Iverson and all those guys, the Elm Decline, all that sort of stuff, people started to think, hey, we can really know a bit about this. And so, you know, that was one of the things we came deliberately to get. And we did, you know, we took a course, we had Jim Dixon and Terry Keating.
Oh, right,
And they took a core, for instance, from the Loch of Scale, and they had a platform which was just below the water in the Loch of Scale. So as you sort of drove past, it looked like these two were walking on water. It was really spooky. It spooked a lot of drivers.
I just feel sorry for the people who walked out to meet them. So, because I guess it's the early 70s when you're starting to see a lot more debate about the nature of analysis and interpretation, lots of new methods, as you say, coming online. Was there much of a conversation with other people working on the Neolithic during that time with you?
Not so much, but there was quite a lot of discussion about, techniques we should use. So, for instance, we used a froth flotation machine, which I think is almost one of the first times in Britain that it had been used. It was all sandy soils. And, maybe we've got a picture somewhere.
I think we have this. So these are the trenches.
That's the BBC.
Nice scaffolding.
That's the BBC putting that tower up to film. They had a time-lapse camera on the main trench, and I remember Paul Johnson bringing us the rushes to show us, and he couldn't ask a question for something like 15 minutes because the whole team was so convulsed with laughter because it looked like people were chasing their tails, and these tapes sort of whipped in and out of the trench. Anyway, they went ahead.
It's like one of those speeded up nature films of a mouse
that's right.
being devoured. Yeah.
But humans don't appear well in those time lapse things.
No. This is the one.
Now that's the froth flotation, and this is the contrast in Orkney weather, isn't it? Yeah. There's Cognac with his shirt off, and there's the wet sievers, and we wet sieved all of the soil. Everything that we dug, we put through a 3mm sieve. They were nested basket sieves, 3mm sieve and a 1mm sieve. So, and that was, I think, almost the first time that, certainly in Scotland, that anyone had really seriously sieved at all. And it, of course, yielded all the stuff like fishbone that was just at the level where people don't see it.
Yeah.
And, as you know, there's so much perception written into what you discover and what you don't find. So, none of the team had ever seen pumice before. So when they found it, they thought it was burnt bone, with the surface off.
Yeah, because it has a similar.
Yeah, it took ages for people to actually recognise pumice in the trench.
Yeah.
Things like that. Yeah.
Excellent. So was there much exchanges with people like Colin Renfrew? Because
because Colin was digging it at Quanderness at the same time. And so we used to go, he would bring his team over and we'd discuss it. We'd go into Quanderness and see the excavations there. So there was quite a lot of sort of evening discussion with Colin and his team, because of course he had other paleobotanists and other
Well, he had all the Cambridge economists, didn't he?
Yeah. But Cognac, the guy that's doing the reason we got one of these machines was because he was in the Higgery at Cambridge,
right. Okay.
And so that was where we got a lot of our ideas from. Was filtered by Cognac, but
excellent.
He was now, I think, on the board of Historic Environment Scotland.
Probably not without his shirt, I would imagine.
No.
Who knows? With Colin Renfrew, the other thing that prompted my mind when you were talking about it was, I know you've written elsewhere, maybe a little bit more recently, but about the way in which the Neolithic of Scotland and in particular the Neolithic of Orkney has been written often with an agenda or with a set of assumptions that have actually been brought in from elsewhere, particularly from England.
Because that was, when I came, I know there's nothing to do with me, but when I came, that was still the sort of mindset of Scottish archaeology, not just in the Neolithic, but throughout prehistory, which was that everything came from England. And nobody did anything novel in Scotland. The idea that anyone actually might have changed their behaviour in Scotland was totally impossible. They would it was just a century or two after, And I think it was partly because, the universities like Edinburgh was staffed by people like Piggott and Atkinson, and then Charles Thomas, and they were all Southerners who were wedded to the south of England, and their images of the Neolithic work, particularly Atkinson and Piggott, were built round monuments in Wessex.
Yeah, it's funny with Piggott, because, you know, regional cultures, you know,
Yeah.
his book from, was it 54 or something like that?
Yeah, near the cultures, yeah.
Yeah. That has a strong sort of sense of things are not always the same, you know, as you move around the country. But he does downplay it a lot.
Yeah.
'Cause you studied with him, is that right? Or you worked
Yes,
with him?
I did my doctorate with
Yeah,
him,
yeah. So what was he like?
Well, Stewart was, I mean, he was one of these characters. I mean, in terms of doctoral supervision, it was bizarre because, you know, he lived just down the road from where I lived in Edinburgh, and I'd meet him, you know, on a Saturday morning or something, and he'd say, "Oh, David, time we talked about your doctorate." And I'd say, "Well, yeah, okay." And he'd say, "Come down on Wednesday and have a gin." So we'd go down and have a couple of gins, and then, you know, Stuart's eyes would glaze over, and you knew that was the time to say, "Bye-bye, Stewart." And any time you asked him a question, he said, "Well, David, you know more about this than I do." And that was the level of his supervision. So it wasn't. It was really strange, but you know, but he was an incredibly generous guy who let you use. I mean, he had a fabulous library, and he let me use that, and he was very helpful with Scarborough and supporting Scarborough. And he came in 1973. He came to see the excavations, and he sat all of the team down one evening on a perfect sunny evening, and we watched the sunset. And he was going on about how there'll be a green flash. You know, in India there's a green flash, and so anyway, that set him off reminiscing all about his days in ancient India and all that. So it was.
No, I only met him once or twice, but yeah, it had a real breadth to him.
Yeah. No, he was, you know, I mean, what amazes me now is how little anyone takes any notice of what, because I'd go back to a lot of the stuff, and people are rewriting what Stewart said in the 60s and 70s, you know.
That's a real big problem with the discipline, short memories and very superficial reading. Yeah, actually, I think.
Well, it's
not for everyone, but I mean.
No, but a lot of people, a lot of students won't read anything except online.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't understand that, but anyway,
certainly, I think, you know, reading him, it was the first time that I seriously thought about antiquarianism. And, you know, his work on, you know, to illustrate the monuments, it's great. Actually.
Really, and that was what was really nice. Actually, most of the time was. He wasn't really supervising, but we would have discussions about it. And, you know, he was much more interested in the 18th century. And I was looking at barrow digging, and there's barrow digging in the 18th century. Most of it is the real big stuff is the 19th century. Yeah. And, you know, he was always... So there was an exchange of views. And
And he was, I mean, this isn't entirely about Stewart, obviously, tonight, but he was part of a kind of social network that included lots of at that time, the leading British artists, wasn't he?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you know, when you went to his flat on Great King Street, you know, there were pipers and...
he was a good friend of John Pipers.
Yeah, and sort of, you know, letters from Betjeman and, you know, all sorts of... I mean, you know, he was really plugged into all of that sort of stuff. And that's an area that actually I'm surprised we haven't seen more writing about, is the archaeology of that period, the 20s and 30s, that's developed those, you know, because when I came to Edinburgh, British archaeology was dominated by Hawkes and Clarke and Pigott, the three big men. You know, they were the...
What Jacquetta Hawkes called the empty mine behind the floral waistcoat, I think.
That's right.
She's very cool. Very sharp. But I mean, a lot of, whether it's Ben Nicholson or Piper less so. I mean, they're really interested in archaeology and also inspired by it. Aerial photography. I mean, Crawford's contribution to the way that British art developed over that time is, I think, there's a really nice book, Bloody Old Britain.
Yes.
Kitty Hauser.
Yes, absolutely. Really like about Crawford, No, there's a lot of good stuff starting to appear, but it's, you know, it's still, I think, a relatively unexplored period.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And Paul Nash is another big figure in all of that.
Absolutely. The equivalents for the megaliths.
Yes.
Okay. I quite happily talk about that for ages, actually. But let's go back to Skara Brae for a bit. So
I think, you know, the difference with Scarborough was we were there, we came with those three agendas that we wanted to find some answers to, whereas Colin came with his agenda about
the emergence of social
segmented
complexity.
societies and all that nonsense, and he was going to find it. That was what I always felt, and he did find it, and he was quite revolutionary in the sense of it made a lot of other people think about, even if they weren't going to agree with him, they were at least, it made them think about
So
stuff
that's,
in a new way.
that's the paper, isn't it? Monuments and Mobilisation,
Yeah.
which is the Wessex based.
That's
so
right,
1973 when you were digging.
Yeah.
When I was an undergraduate, the people who were teaching me were just going, oh, you know, that's just old school, we don't do that anymore. But over time, I've come to have quite a lot of respect for the way that he set that up.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, actually. Okay, so maybe it would be nice if we could talk a little bit about some of the insights that have come from the work that you were doing at Scarborough.
Sure.
So, I mean, one place to start might be with thinking about the phasing and the duration of the settlement.
Yeah, it's been. I mean, I think one of the to preface that is to say that one of the things we have to get our head around is that we know that Scarborough is not one of the early grooved ware settlements. And for a long time, it was, well, because it was virtually the only one, it kind of sat there and seemed like it must be an early one. And so now what do we find? Well, we found, and went on for quite a long time with, Child had 4 phases, and it always seemed to me that, a couple of them were pretty trivial, and when we dug, the stratigraphy suggested there were 2 phases, and we went on with that for quite a long time before we realised that there was what we've called phase 0, which is right at the bottom, and which is, 2 or 3 centuries earlier than, and doesn't appear to be certainly grooved ware. It's not clear because actually we got almost no material from it, apart from this huge collection of carbonized grain. And
which the date for that's, is it?
It's like probably 32, 3100 BC. And so and then what we've done, obviously a lot of radiocarbon dates. I think it's 115 or something like that. And the modelling, the Bayesian modelling. Although I have to say, I sometimes wonder if Bayesian modelling gives us what we're asking for. But anyway, we weren't really asking for it. But it says that the first phase is very short, possibly 50 years, certainly not more than that, about 125. And then there's a break, again, well, it depends how long you think the first phase 1 is. So the break moves, but then it starts again in somewhere around 2800, 2900, and goes to 2400. So the second phase is that what we're not able to do, because obviously we can't demolish anything, is we can't relate our section to when the houses that most people see were constructed. I mean, they're somewhere in that. And presumably they're quite early, but I mean that's still a presumption.
Well, it's very difficult given the small windows that you were able to work in. I think definitely. But because Sue Dyke reminded me of this. There's a date for cereal, isn't it? The cereal pollen, which is back to 3600.
Yeah, well, it's being picked up in the cores.
From the
Cereal grains.
cereal grains. So there's people about before our dated sequence at the site. Definitely.
And that the cereal pollen that we got, it was for all the effort with that froth flotation machine. We never got any cereal out of it, and when we got down to this basal level, it was really tough. You know, it was very clayey. And the wet sievers couldn't get it through the sieves, so they piled it all into a big bath that we were using and filled it with water and walked away. And the next morning we went there, and the surface was absolutely black with grain that had come out of this stuff.
Excellent.
Yeah, it was a quite amazing moment, yeah.
Yeah, the bath at our house looks like that after I've been on site for a day. That's incredible. So broadly speaking, two major phases.
Yeah.
The first one fairly short, starting on the dated sequence at 31, something like that.
Yeah. Or a little later.
Or a little later. Going on for a century or so, then a hiatus in the dating that we've got.
And maybe even, you know, 3,000 to 2,900, or even, maybe 2,950 to, you know, to 2,850, and then, a break.
No, I remember when a lot of the dating was first being discussed, and the idea of phases and breaks, that there was a lot of people going, well, you know, why would you have that? Why would there be a break? With the benefit of hindsight, or the benefit with several more decades of work, when we have sequences from Neolithic settlements in Orkney on a number of islands in the archipelago, they all show that, really. They have long sequences, but they're punctuated.
Yeah,
and sometimes
it's people going back to a place they know, but they've left. Yeah. And that was one of the things when we went, you see, we were trying to look at the whole issue of, you know, how did they, if it had been continuous, you know, what happened? Did you just level the site? And where did you live while you leveled the site? And the other thing was, of course, that we believed in those days that they mounded up the Midden and so the question was, where did they get the Midden from? Yeah, it was all that kind of, you know, questions that you were asking without much in the way of answers, it's fair to say.
No, it's this idea that there are places that have long but broken histories, and some of the intervals may be very, very short. I mean, it might be just you know, a handful of years, or maybe it's something that's measured at generational time. That you might, you know, a family or a community falls away, falls apart. Others come in afterwards. There's a kind of resolution there which we find it really hard to get at. But, you know,
but it's definitely there. I think no one.
It's a tricky thing to convey. I mean, I think the way that Scarborough is presented now is great. It's really impressive. But I know that a lot of people visiting for the first time cannot really get their heads around, despite the best efforts of everyone who works there.
You know, it's
time depth.
It's really difficult. You know, I mean, most of us are not used to looking. We don't view buildings by standing up above and looking down into them. You know, that's not the way we normally read. So, in sort of straightforward perception terms, it's quite a challenging site to go and go and visit.
It is.
You know, and however hard, and that makes it, you know, that is a very weird experience of sort of walking around at roof level.
Yeah. And you're walking through time as well.
Difficult absolutely.
For people to get the hang of that. I mean, I think one or two other things I wanted to ask about. One is to do with the sort of character and the biography of buildings. Now, you know, there are a lot of sites where we could show evidence that a building is constructed, it stands for a while, is demolished, and other buildings come in and replace it. And there are elements of that. You can see the reworking of buildings in the Scarborough sequence. But what isn't always caught is the appearance of buildings. And one of the things that I remember talking to you about ages ago was clay and rendering.
Yeah, I mean, I think you are sort of picking pieces out of child's narratives, but it does sound as though what they found was, in effect, clay on the outside of the walls, presumably as a way of weatherproof it, you know. I don't know, but that seems to have been the thing. And the one fragment of early house that we got, although it had been levelled,
There was quite
There
a
was
bit of
clay on, it was sat on it in
Yeah.
clay, yeah.
Yeah, because there's one or two sites in the Bay of Firth, I think, that various people, Colin, Nick and others, were involved in, where they've got, it looks like clay render as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's something we forget. I mean, it's not necessarily everywhere, but
No,
may well
I
have
think
been
that's
part of
it. It's,
yeah. The other thing that, obviously, if you're working on any Neolithic site, well, indeed, almost any period site here, that does come up again and again is Midden and the nature of Midden.
Yeah, you know, my co-author, Lecky Shepherd, you know, she's pretty hot on Midden, and she's pretty abusive about what she sees as the misuse of the term. And, you know, but there's no question that there's a lot of Midden there. Now, it's not all Midden in the sequence. It's not a solid mass of Midden. There's sandy bits and this kind of stony bits. But, you know, and so Midden, Lecky wants Midden restricted to, you know, genuine refuse.
Yeah, yeah. And understandably, I mean, it's certainly something that's cropping up at the Ness as well, that we have, you know, really nice demonstrable primary Midden deposits,
Yeah.
you know, stuff that's being built up by being dumped, but then it's being reused.
Yeah.
And it's used as part of the building process.
Well, that's happened
have
at
that.
Scarborough too.
Yeah,
Yeah, you see the cores of the walls, as
Yeah.
far as we can tell. You know, they haven't really taken them down, but insofar as we can tell, it's Midden. Yeah, it's a stone facing on either side with Midden core.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was certainly the case with the once wall that we had from the early house. Yeah.
What was it like to work there as a team? There we go.
Yeah. I haven't really changed very much since those days, but
Not a bit.
But some of the others have aged quite a lot. You know? It's quite interesting because, you know, out of that team there are quite a lot of people who then went on to be quite important. Yeah, Arthur McGregor and Ian Ralston.
Which one's Ian?
See if I can work out
I want
which
to make
one.
you walk.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out which one is Ralston. Oh, this is Ralston. It's between the two of the Orkney squad. So that's Ralston.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And this is Arthur McGregor.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this, amazingly, is Ian Shepherd.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, difficult to recognise.
Yes, indeed.
So, yeah, there were quite a lot of people that worked at the site who then went on to have, you know, careers in archaeology.
Yeah, yeah. So where were you all staying?
The first year we stayed in the Standing Stones Hotel, and the second year we went to the Barony at Bursley.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was, you know, we were, and of course, you know, just at the back, the second from the right is John Drever, who ran the Orkney squad, Orkney and Shetland squad for, my God, I don't even know what they were called then. Was it Scottish Development Department? I mean, the name of this organisation has changed about 6 times in my career. But anyway, because we had the members of the Orkney squad came and, you know, did literally all the heavy lifting.
Right.
You know, they hauled the buckets out and they built the shoring. They did all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it was quite extensive shuttering, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And that was one of the amazing things about going over to Quanternest, because there was Colin digging in this tomb, this enormous tomb, with no shuttering at all. And we thought, bloody hell, you know, this might well fall in on him. But anyway, it didn't fall in on him, and it was fine. But you know, but obviously, the Scottish Development Department did not want the wall of Passage A to fall into the trench and so on. And it was, you know, it was a deep trench, it was over 4 meters when we finished.
Sure, sure. I've got a couple of questions. These ones are from Sue. I would be very interested to know what David's excavations revealed about the landscape around Scarborough. What trees, plants, crops were growing around, and how did that change over time?
It's interesting because, you know, Dixon and Keating were pretty much of the opinion that if you removed the field boundaries and telegraph posts and so on, you were pretty much looking at the same landscape. I think that people are less certain that that was the case. I mean, they were very much of the opinion that, you know, all trees had gone and, or that if there were trees, they were kind of stunted little, you know, like bushes. But then when you look at the, you know, the stuff from the waterlogged deposit, you know, only 27% of it is from driftwood. Yeah, it's from North America. So, you know, you have to. You're still faced with the problem, and I don't feel that they. Of course, when they did their pollen analysis and all the rest, we didn't have the identifications on the wood.
Yeah.
So they didn't have this conflict that they had to resolve. But it seems to me that now most people would not regard this completely treeless landscape image as what they...
No. It's another example of what you were saying earlier on about the assumptions you inherit from an earlier generation and then carry into one's own work. There's definitely a sense up here in the archaeology that people say they're building in stone very well. That's because of the geology and it lends itself to that. And of course they would have had to because there was no trees. Definitely doing that thing of, I'm on a site and I look up and assume that everything else is stable.
Yeah, and it's really strange, isn't it? Because when you look at the furniture bit in the houses, I mean, it's wooden planks, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's all split.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And driftwood, I mean, I think is probably quite a significant thing, but I think a lot of evidence over the last few decades has started to really establish that there are lots of trees around.
Yeah.
But they do go over time through the Neolithic and Bronze Age. So there would have been more available, but driftwood I think
and
is
I think
significant.
the other thing that they were saying was they were reluctant to see much in the way of peat in the landscape. They didn't think that had really got going, and so that it wasn't. They didn't see that as a significant source of fuel, for instance.
Which it is there. You've got quite a lot of turf burning, haven't you?
Yeah, it's turf but also, you know, there's evidence of burning bone, you know, particularly whalebone. There's evidence of seaweed. So, you know, there's pretty much the evidence that they were just using whatever they got, whatever was available.
Yeah. I think when I'm thinking about, I mean, in terms of both timber needed for construction, but certainly when you look at buildings, the amount of timber that must have been needed to hold up the roofs.
Yeah.
I mean, on some of the smaller structures, there are all sorts of workarounds, but you know, with some of the larger buildings we've seen over the last 30 years or more, you need big trees for those.
Yeah, and I think you were getting big trees. You know, I mean, we're talking about virgin forests effectively in North America, and these enormous rivers, cutting through them and eroding them. And I think, you know, they were getting huge trunks.
Well, there are sort of 17th century, early 18th century accounts of people going over from Europe to the northeast coast of America and Canada, and having to park up effectively half a mile out because it's just driftwood. And walking across it.
And you know, it's very difficult to see nowadays, but the Siberian coast is still, and the pictures there, you know, they're piled high with really big trunks. So,
I've often wondered if there's a kind of analogous thing with what you get on the commons in England, where there are very strict rules about who can take what. So firewood, that's fine. Anything structural belongs to the Lord.
Yeah, I think that's, and I think that they must have been controlled, because we have almost no charcoal. We have charcoal, some charcoal, and some wood charcoal, but none of it is of driftwood species.
Yeah.
So again, rather suggests that stuff was seen as of course, the other side is, you know, what was the story they were telling to themselves to explain these enormous trees? I mean, maybe, you know, if you look in, you go to the bay and so on, you see these enormous fronds of seaweed. Do you also have an image that actually these trees are growing under the water, just out there a bit, and they're just washing in?
Nice idea.
Or does it give you this sense of a distant land that you can't reach and you don't know about? I mean, the answers to that would make quite a different set of explanations that you would have.
No, absolutely. But again, I think that's really interesting, but it also ties into the way that perspectives have changed over the last sort of 30, 40 years, with perhaps more of a direct interest in that broader landscape or seascape.
Yeah.
Which we'll come back to in a minute. But the other question raised by Sue was, what evidence for wild foodstuffs do you find?
You know, I saw this and I thought, you know, I'm going to give a totally ambiguous and totally unhelpful answer. The difficulty is identifying, you know, wild stuff, whether it's they're getting it for food. So if I give you an example, you know, there are 500 plus bone points from Scarborough, and there are about 20, almost all of them are made of domesticated animal bone, but there are about 20 that are made from the humerus of an adult gannet. And the question is, why would anyone go to all this trouble? You've got, And the answer that we've come up with is that they're using them for tattooing. And the wear pattern fits with, there's a guy in Canada who's done quite a lot of work with bone points and tattooing, and the wear patterns are there. And it is, what happens is bird bone, because it's hollow in the middle, it's incredibly strong, and it gives a very sharp point.
Yeah.
And I've been working with a tattooist in Edinburgh to explore this a little bit more, and it certainly seems possible, and indeed, one of these points appears to have what might be the remains of ink on it. Oh. But there, you see, the question is, you know, are they going out and getting the gannets to eat them? Or are they going there to get the gannets because they want the feathers and they want the bone, but they're, you know, I mean, one of the things I've been playing with is that, you know, if you watch gannets diving, it's like they're tattooing the sea. Yeah, and you know, you wonder, is there a connection, or am I just making all this up? And probably I'm making it all up, I understand that, but, you know, it keeps me happy of an evening. And, but, you know, the question there is so quite a lot of the time, it's not easy to tell whether you are dealing with wild food stuff or you're dealing with material, yeah? So there is, like, there's eggshell, certainly that, but again, you know, some of it's eider, and you think, are they also getting eider down, or are they getting the ducks?
And oil as well. Yeah.
So I just, you know, there clearly is wild foodstuffs, you know, the deer, there's wild boar, or there's tusks of wild boar, that kind of stuff. But, you know, the evidence, and obviously the sea is providing, and probably the Loch of Scale as well is providing stuff, fish. But, and you know, my assumption is that all of that is for food, but then some of it, like eels, and you know, I'm just quite by chance reading a book on my way up here, where they're talking about Italians using eel skins as a substitute for leather.
And salmon, it's salmon used for sandpaper.
That's right,
well.
yeah. So, you know, then you start thinking, well, I mean, I guess what you're talking about is, yes, of course they're eating them, but at the same time they're using
everything
and they can to...
Is that the Book of Eels?
No,
the Book of Eels is brilliant. It's really, really nice.
Yeah. So, the answer is that it's difficult, I think, to be sure with some of these things, like the gannets, whether they're going to get them. And one of the things I haven't been able to resolve with bird specialists is whether the humery of a gannet that's about to fly but doesn't yet fly, is that the same as an adult gannet?
Right.
And if so, of course, then they could get them easily, because that's the way you get the gugas, yeah. But but if it isn't, then catching gannets is not a straightforward matter. Adult gannets, they don't just fly up and give themselves up to you, and so I think that they're special birds, and they're not probably eaten.
I think they know they're cool as well.
Yeah.
Well, again, I could talk about that for a lot longer. Maybe just step back a little bit, still about Skara Brae, really. As you said earlier on, when you approached the site, it was really the only one, and certainly the only one where we had upstanding architecture. And very quickly, that gave it a particular kind of elevated status. It was an important site at that stage, thought to be one of the earliest, and we now know from Pappy and one or two other places, on Wyre, for example, that there are earlier buildings. But quite a lot of the literature that's built up around Orkney and the Neolithic talks about it as if it had this elevated status.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you thought about that, or whether or not there's that poem that George Mackay Brown wrote. It talks about, here in this village, we are little regarded by the lords of Tilth and Loch, which was brilliant.
Yeah. The thing about what made Scarborough special was not just that there were these amazing buildings, but there was all this bone work. And of course, for most, alternatively, the thing would have been to go maybe to Rinio. Mm-hmm. But Rinio doesn't have any bone, because the soil conditions are, acidic. Yeah. And not much shell. Whereas Scarborough is sitting on this shell sand. And that's still one of the things that makes it different from almost all the other sites, apart from Noltland. Yeah?
Which is very good. We'll just say about bigger. This is taken from the recent volume on geophysical survey across the World Heritage Area. The current site in guardianship that's presented is up at the top. And although some of the really dark linear features are lamprophytic dikes, there's clear evidence that the occupation continues inland.
For a long time I used to think that Scarborough was this big site, and that it both stretched out beyond the guardianship area, and obviously it was out in the sea, and that was my feeling. And now I've come to the view that it probably was a big site in the phase 1. But in phase 2, I think, apart from the house 3 that was washed away, I think we've pretty much got it all.
Certainly on the seaward side.
Yeah. I don't think there was anything much on the seaward side. And when you go and you view the site, one of the things that you realise, if you think about it for a moment, is what they did was they stopped digging as soon as it became a little bit fuzzy. As soon as they didn't have these really nice buildings, they thought, I'll stop. Yeah. And so you've got this, And I think that those houses are all part of one contained, sort of superstructure. And that's the complete phase 2.
Right.
I mean, obviously you've got structure 8, was never always freestanding, and which people, some people think have compared it to like early Bronze Age stuff in Shetland. Well, from Charles' notebooks, I've identified one of the bone tools that's lying on the floor of structure 8.
Oh, right.
So I'm awaiting the radiocarbon date. To see what
that'll be really interesting.
Yeah, what that turns out to be.
But one of the things that you've brought up in your writing about the site is this sense that in the late Neolithic, your phase 2, there's a real emphasis on clustering and making a community out of all those households. So one implication is that the material inshore to the south of the exposed site, where it's more extensive, that's maybe where you'll find more early stuff.
Yeah,
Well,
I think so.
yeah.
And the other thing is that, you know, that later stuff is very atypical.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, you don't find it, and you don't find the same kind of things. It's not just clustering. You don't find the passages. You don't find the furniture is different. You don't find, for instance, cells in the walls of early houses, of the earlier phase houses. You don't find these clay-looted boxes in any of the houses. I mean, I think there's one clay-looted box, or potentially clay-looted box at Barn House, but it's outside of a house. It's just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. And I mean, it might be a parallel. It looks like it is, but so they're very unusual. And suddenly you realise that it's the cells and. You know, for a long time I was peddling this idea that it was the change in the beds, you know, the beds are recessed and then they project out. And of course that's actually quite trivial compared to all the other changes there are in there. And so, you know, curiously for me, phase 2 Scarborough still remains pretty much unique. Yeah.
But
it's a different kind of uniqueness from what we thought when we went to excavate, and it was almost unique.
I think it happens to every excavation I've been on. Yeah, but it's an expression of a theme that you can see, or we're getting glimpses of in other settings in Orkney. Yeah. I'm looking at the clock and thinking maybe we should just talk a little bit about
Noltland.
After Scarborough going to Thinks of Noltland.
Yeah. Well, you know, as part of the initial post-excavation, we looked at, obviously, Petrie's notebooks. And, you know, and he has in one of his notebooks, he talks about going to Westray and going down to the beach, at Noltland, and finding these, you know, this site.
Yeah.
And we weren't the first people that had recognised it, but we were probably the first people that actually realised that what you'd drawn was grooved ware material. And then, so I got some money together for Caroline Wickham-Jones and a woman called Rosemary Bradley.
Oh, yeah.
And they went, and there it was. You know, there was like 1,000 square meters of Midden exposed. You know, it was huge. I mean, it was enormous. They did a little bit, they dug a tiny hole and turned up grooved ware and a couple of bone things, and we thought, wow. And it was clearly being eroded, because the sand was being blown off and the rest. So we went and we excavated, and we went there because, you know, one of the things you can't do with Scarborough is because you can't demolish the stuff, there are all these questions you can't quite answer. You can sort of get an inkling, but you can't. So we thought, well, all we need is a brand new site. And, you know, and because I'd convinced myself at that stage that the Scarborough houses were set into a pre-existing mound of Midden that was dug into, we went there and we tried to do this amazing, what would now be perfectly okay, but in the 70s, late 70s was not okay. Right. We tried to record the three-dimensionality of the Midden. So we contour surveyed the top of each level. We recorded every fragment greater than 1 centimetre. We recorded 13 elements about it, you know, including a full three-dimensional. And this took forever because we didn't have, you know, we didn't have EDMs or anything. And we used to collect this information and we were recording it on a Commodore PET 64K, with the tape drive. And we'd collect the information and we'd go back to the house we were staying at, and the phone, we'd link the phone to Edinburgh University mainframe. We put it on at 9 o'clock in the evening and we switched it off at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's how long it took to just download a day's data. It took virtually half a day to download the data. And, you know, and then of course, we persisted with this. This didn't endear us at all to historic Scotland, and because it was very expensive and nothing seemed to change each time they came. It all looked the same, and then we started to find articulated bone, and so we kind of started to know that this Midden and whatever it was had not been moved around, and so. And then we started digging a little bit more vigorously, I suppose. But we didn't, but it was, you had this sense that it was this enormous site.
Yeah.
And, and we were still doing a lot of 3D recording and things like that. And we sieved everything. Yeah. So, and we had this huge team. Yeah.
There is Caroline.
Yeah, there's Caroline.
Much
yeah.
missed.
And I think
Much
Nick
missed.
behind her.
Is that you, Nick? No. And I can see Animal, Neil Sharples at the back
Yes,
as well.
no, absolutely, yeah.
He was called Animal, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's right, he was in those days.
From the Muppets.
And yeah, so.
And it is huge. I mean, Hazel Moore and Graham Wilson's work has just sort of run away from that. Just huge amounts.
Well, and we did tiny amount over 4 years. And, the pottery assemblage from our excavation is over 10,000 shirts. I'd dread to think what size their post-excavation is, because it's,
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. But it's really interesting because, their work's amazing, and it's giving us a sequence that's running through the latter half of the Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, which is really unusual to get that.
And we had just 2 pieces of beaker out of one of the trenches and so on. And, so yeah, it was. We really went to Noltland because we thought that was going to be the site that would enable us to answer the stuff that we couldn't answer in at Scarborough, and then it just was so huge, and then. Historic Scotland thought this is costing us a fortune, and so their solution was to put it into guardianship. Yeah, so they didn't allow any excavation. They put this fence and they bulldozed it all about, and then of course in the end, what have they done? They've had to excavate the whole damn site.
Yeah, I'm sure they hadn't thought of that when they took it on.
So,
But it's good that it's getting done. One of the things that's always struck me, because the whalebone features quite strongly, even in structural associations. It's I don't know, would I've been there visiting Hazel and Graham on site or whatever, the relationship with the sea for Neolithic people. And it's something that the more time I've spent, I think we've really underestimated the importance of the sea to people.
I think that's certainly true. And I think that we've also not really got much of a handle on how far they were trying to exploit the sea, and how far they were, how can I put it, just passive recipients of the sea. At Scarborough, lots of the pendants are made from the teeth of killer whale. And for a long time I thought, well, hey, maybe they were going out and taking killer whales. But of course, just recently we've been watching killer whales bite yachts and things, and you suddenly think, hey, maybe that wouldn't be a good idea in a skin boat, to try and take on a killer whale. So
it's funny, the question of the boats. I mean, there's a typical archaeological thing. If we haven't found it, it doesn't exist almost. But when people do talk about marine navigation in a context like Orkney or the Northern Isles generally, it's always when the Neolithic people arrive. So it's Alison Sheridan's boats with their first, bonjour, c'est une vache. And then it stops.
Yeah,
but
it doesn't.
Yeah, if you're living across these islands and you've got small herds of cattle and small human populations, there's got to be a to and fro. Yeah. So they must be really skillful in boats.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think, I think that, I've always assumed that they were as skilled as people are today, as Orcadians are today, that the sea is it's an ever-present part of your landscape. And that, being able to manoeuvre it and manoeuvre yourself around it is still really important. And I'm sure that they went out, you know, and they did that.
No, absolutely.
And, you know, and just even in a sense, you know, especially for the smaller islands, could these communities have survived without being able to cross the sea to, you know, get marriage partners from somewhere else? And,
Or cross cattle and all sorts of things
all
like
that kind of thing. You know, you interbreed.
Flitting.
Flitting,
moving your stock from one island to another.
Would all have been essential, I think.
Yeah, and a routine part of life.
Yeah, and also, you know, it's your own, you know, with your own stone stuff, the fact that they're exploiting, as a wider community, they're exploiting the resources, the stone resources, things like hematite and so on, which is not sort of everywhere. Yeah. They've had to have this kind of, you know, wider thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting with stone, you see it with other materials as well. If we find an object, we've had some at the Nest, you've got some at Scarborough, which have come from a good way away, which we identify somehow as exotic, then we spot them and we make a big deal of them. When you're dealing with raw materials that are accessible in Orkney, we just switch off and just say, well, it's local. But, you know, it might be that it's come across the archipelago. Certainly a lot of the flint work is moving around like
that. And the interesting thing is that at Scarborough, we've never found anything that needs to have come from outside Orkney.
No.
You know, maybe the boar's tusks and things. I mean, there are things you can make a case for them having come, but there's not absolutely that.
But there is stuff that's come from particular islands or from at least other islands, not mainland. And it's that kind of regional scale of exchanges, you know, movement of people.
And I think that, you know, I think the sea was really, really important.
So let's just pull that bit together. I mean, one question that I think I obviously want to address is this work has been pulled together. I know there's been loads and loads of specialist work going on. So, I mean, look at this. I don't know if you can see what that is. It's an elephant, and it's in the room, which is publication. How's it going?
Well, you know, there are moments when I think it's really close to finishing, and there are other moments when I think it's not very close to finishing. But I think that essentially, Lecky and I have got to the point where, having lived our whole life with it, we feel we have to bring it to an end. And so we're partly tempted by Pete Marshall saying there'll be a new calibration curve in 2025, and you know, you sort of think, well, maybe we should just hang on for the. But actually, you know, I think that would be. I mean, my guess is that it won't appear before 2025 because it'll take probably a year to do all the necessary stuff after we finish. But that would be our expectation, is that it will be ready.
Brilliant.
To be on the shelves of people by 2025.
All right. Oh, that's great to hear.
The difficulty is, you know, if I had been, you know, I was so full of youthful pride. You know, if I'd just done the smart thing, I would have just written up the 2 trenches, which are not that big, and walked away from it. But the thing was that I felt that Child had failed to give anybody a proper impression of the wealth of the assemblages from Scarborough. And so we set out to do all of that. And that was, you know, probably the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life. So.
Yeah, it's a strange thing. We were talking about Roger Mercer yesterday. And there's a problem that you see for keepers and curators in museums, but also for academic archaeologists, is you do a project, it gets you a job, it sets you up, but then when you've got the job, you don't get the time.
That's it.
It's really, really difficult.
Yeah, and the other thing that we had with Scarborough was that it came just on the cusp of the appearance of rescue archaeology, and one of the consequences of rescue archaeology was the fact that you then had to pay specialists to write specialist reports. And we had kind of worked on this presumption that we'd get all our specialist reports done for nothing by people in universities. And, you know, that was probably a foolish expectation in the first place, but and then suddenly we were caught in this world where everybody wanted to be paid and we had no money. And it took us quite a long time to, start getting together the money to do it. And that, I think, is also one of the big problems.
And again, it's really easy to get people to give you money to discover things, rather less to do the work.
Yeah, and the awfulness is that you can get money to be the pioneer, but as soon as you want to turn it into an everyday, practical application, there's no money to do it.
Some things haven't changed all that much. I think maybe because we're getting on a bit in time, maybe I'm just getting on a bit. No, just to step back a little bit more. We're working in the 70s, writing through more recently about the Neolithic in Orkney. This is a question from Julie. Of the most recent research into Neolithic Orkney, what surprised, delighted or confused you the most? And I would add to that, how has the Neolithic landscape changed since you were working at Scarborough and the links?
Well, I mean, it's just changed that more recognition because, when we went to Noltland, that was only the third grooved ware site. I mean, up until then we had Scarborough and we had Ringo, and they'd been around for a while, and that was it.
Yeah.
And then Noltland, so Noltland was this big discovery. And then, particularly Colin Richards, who, brave boy, rejected all of the views of the Scottish archaeological establishment that you couldn't do field walking in with any benefit and any result in places like Orkney. Came and did it, and found Barnhouse, and then found lots of other sites, and other people have field walked, and it's now an established technique. But but when he came, I can remember people standing around in Edinburgh meetings just saying, the boy's crazy. The boy's crazy.
But it's another example of the kind of short-term memory with archaeologists, because going through looking at all the stone assemblages. I mean, the late 19th century field walking by farmers.
I know.
Amazing. Yeah. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting the way that we just ignored all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are people who are collecting really extensively, and then there are farmers who just work on their own fields. And often it seems, almost into competition with the farmer next door. As to who can find most broken mace heads and things like that. And I think but what's changed is that the map of, so to speak, Neolithic Orkney settlements, though the tombs have not increased significantly, but the settlements is just and then on top of that you've got Ness, which doesn't fit with anybody's preconceptions about I mean these places are just too big, too sophisticated. I mean they're just
really difficult for people like me to get my head around.
Well, no, I mean I think it's not really that far. Well, 20 years or so. We never expected to find something like that, so we didn't. And then a chance comes and you do. And I don't think even then that we'd recognise the implications of Colin's work. To suddenly find that you've got a late Neolithic settlement in that particular case of a few centuries, right in the middle of all the monuments. And then, more recently the Ness. To have something that big with all the characteristics that it's got.
Yeah, and it's,
those that we understand.
And so, I think the whole effect of that has been, for us, our work on Scarborough, has to kind of made us sort of focus back in on Scarborough and not, because, you kind of think, normally you would, with something like Scarborough, you'd expect the final chapter to be this grand, narrative about Neolithic and Orkney. And you kind of think, there's no point in writing this. I mean, it's all going to change, but he'll be out of date by the time it's in print. And, but at the same time, I think what we'd want to do is to focus back in on Scarborough and just try and remind people of just how wonderful Scarborough is.
We need both. We need that really sort of local focus on the history of places. Because I think the last 20, from Colin's time onwards really, I mean, the other Colin, Renfrew, had already established that we had fairly complex
Yeah.
worlds in which these things are being constructed, but I think that's the thing that's really striking in the last 30 years or so.
Yeah.
The Neolithic's got a lot more complex in
Yeah.
social terms.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you know, the nest is extraordinary, absolutely remarkable. And so immediately people start, as very much has happened with Mike Parker Pearson and others' work at Durrington Walls, they go, well, you know, there's so much labour in this, and there's so much going on with stuff moving in all over the place. We need to revise our models. And he starts talking about things like dynasties and kingship and so on.
Yeah.
Not sure whether that's necessarily valid, but the narrative becomes much more complicated. And then you step back and go, well, actually, there's 6 Durrington Walls.
Yeah.
So what kind of world creates that? And we've got the same here, because the nest is beyond anything we've seen, but we know from geophysical surveys that there are more of them.
Yeah, but the nest is kind of the sort, for me, a symbol of the fact that, you know, I mean, when we came to dig at Scarborough and Colin came to dig at Quandoness and so on, Orkney had been, you know, it had those great moments in the late 20s and the 30s, and then it kind of died to death.
Yeah.
And suddenly it was coming back, and like, nest kind of is the symbol of the huge amount of energy that now has gone into, prehistoric Orkney in my academic time, in my lifetime. It's phenomenal.
Yeah. We've been going for an hour and 20 minutes. Yeah, I mean, I think we've
Focused more than we expected to. Perhaps that was foolish of me on the Neolithic story and David's work. So perhaps we'll stop at that point rather than go into the other things. But David, I've really enjoyed that.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks very much.
An object lesson, ladies and gentlemen, in archaeological investigation. For those of you, and I'm looking around at the audience tonight, the professional archaeologists, the student archaeologists, the enthusiastic lay people, and the happily and fertilely ignorant amongst us, we've had an object lesson in a conversation in archaeology. The sifting of evidence, the mature reflection on a period of over 40 years ago, further speculation that arises out of that, some philosophical speculations as well, a dash of politics of what it means to work in archaeology, and the whole thing overlaid with a quiet, dry realism that I recognise, that I suspect, not being an archaeologist myself, but must be a very important ingredient in the research. It's been bookended by the work of Skara Brae from the early 70s, and finishing off with speculations and thoughts on the exciting work going on at Verness and Brodgar. I know some of you will have questions answered tonight. I know I have, but I'm almost certain there will be as many questions that have been raised and provoked by tonight's conversation. And indeed, that's the nature of conversations that we want to have and that we want to regard as our legacy for the future. So, my thanks again to Dr David Clarke and Professor Mark Edmunds. Please join me in thanking them again.